Hey guys, this is your community group video for this week. This is the second week in our series, League of Judges. I mentioned in the first sermon and in your video last week that the stories of all of the major judges in the book of Judges take place according to a cycle. The cycle goes like this. The people of Israel sin, or the way the book of Judges puts it is they do what is evil in the sight of God. God hands them over to their enemies as a natural consequence of their sin. The people finally cry out to God for help, and then God raises up this heroic-like figure who will rescue them from the oppression that they are under because of their enemies, because of the sin that they have committed against God. Now, when we come to Judges 6, Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8, the group of people that are oppressing the Israelites because they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, well, they're called the Midianites. And for 7 years in a row, the Midianites would sweep into Israel for several months, probably during the harvest time of the year, and they would just sort of they would take all of the Israelites' food that they had harvested, they would take all of their cattle that they had raised that year, and then leave the Israelite villages desolate when they went back across the Jordan River to their own land. And because this had happened every year for 7 years in a row, the people of Israel had taken to hiding in the cliffs and caves and crags of the mountains so that they could avoid being killed or harassed by the Midianites. And so they finally call out for help, and the hero that God is going to raise up in the story is a guy named Gideon. But what's really interesting is when we first find Gideon in the story, he's not heroic at all. As a matter of fact, he's not going to be very heroic throughout the story. So when we first find Gideon, he's actually hiding in a wine press that would have been a big stone vat built into the ground somewhere. And he's actually threshing some grain in that wine press. And the reason he's in the wine press, we're told, is because he's hiding from the Midianites. So he doesn't begin as a very heroic figure. Well, the angel of the Lord appears to Gabriel and tells him that God is raising him up to defeat the Midianites. Gabriel doubts that this is really the angel of the Lord, so he runs back home, gets an offering, brings an offering back, and the angel touches the offering, and the offering is consumed in flames. And so at that point, Gideon finally believes that this is the Lord who is speaking to him. And the Lord tells Gideon, you are to go back and destroy the altar to Baal and the Asherah pole that your father has erected. Gideon's dad, like most of the people of Israel, had slipped into worshiping the god Baal. And his dad had built an altar to Baal in his village and had also constructed an Asherah pole, which was another way of worshiping the false god. And Gideon does what the Lord tells him to do. He destroys the altar and the Asherah pole, but he doesn't do it in very heroic fashion because he gathers 10 men and sneaks out to do it at night so that none of the other villagers will know that he has done this. Well, the next day they do discover that it was Gideon who did this, and Gideon's dad actually steps in to sort of rescue him from the turmoil and basically says, look, if this has offended Baal, you let Baal deal with Gideon if he's a real God. And so Gideon is saved from the ire and the wrath of the villagers. Gideon then starts collecting his army together to defeat the Midianites, but he's still unsure as to whether or not he can actually be a hero, as to whether or not God is actually going to help him in this battle. And so Gideon conducts this test to make sure, and he says to God, he says this, I will put some wool on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece, that's the piece of wool, is wet with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you are going to help me rescue Israel as you promised. Well, he wakes up the next morning and finds that that's the case, but then he's still not sure. He's still such a reluctant, almost scaredy cat kind of hero. So again, he says, please don't be angry with me, God, but let me make one more request. This time, let the fleece remain dry while the ground around it is wet with dew. And that night God did just that, and Gideon had some encouragement that God was actually going to be with him, that he actually could be the hero in this story. Well, in the next bit of the story, God tells Gideon, you have too many warriors. He's gathered about 32,000 men, and through a rather strange set of events, God whittles Gideon's army down from 32,000 to only 300 men. But there's a sense in which God knows that even though the fleece, even though God worked through the fleece to show Gideon that he was going to be with him, God still recognizes that Gideon's got a lot of fear, that he's still not feeling like a hero. So God tells Gideon to sneak over to the camp of the Midianites, and God is going to do something that will ensure that will assure Gideon that he's going to be with him. And so Gideon and a friend of his sneak over to the Midianite camp, and they hear one Midianite recounting this dream, and the interpretation of the dream on the other Midianite interprets the dream to mean that the Midianites are going to be destroyed by Israel. And this sort of finally gives Gideon the courage to defeat the Midianites. And so the battle, it's not really a battle. The Midianites the Israelites, these 300 Israelites blow their trumpets and break these shattered pieces of glass that have torches in them during the nighttime, and it frightens the Midianites, and the Midianites end up in this sort of great big kerfluffle where they're killing each other and hurting each other because it's dark and they think they're being attacked and they can't tell what's going on. And so Gideon becomes victorious over the Midianites. Now, the interesting thing about Gideon is that he never appears very heroic throughout the entire story. And so one of the things we talked about on Sunday is that really God can turn anyone into a hero. If God could turn Gideon into a hero, God can make a hero out of anyone. But the other thing we said in addition to that we learned from the story of Gideon is that, yes, God can make a hero out of anyone, but any hero can also turn into a villain. Because Gideon has so often looked to the Lord when he's feeling afraid and when he's not sure what to do, and he's asked the Lord for help. But there comes this point when we see a crack in sort of Gideon's willingness to ask the Lord for help. And so twice during the battle, Gideon's battle cry is that the Israelites are to attack for God, but then he says also for Gideon. Attack for the glory of God and of Gideon, he says. And there's a sense in which Gideon is starting to no longer rely on the Lord, but he's starting to rely on himself. And as a result of that, Gideon's going to end up at the end of his story accepting this ephod, which is this bejeweled piece of clothing from the people, and he accepts it as an honor for what a great hero he is. And the people of Israel, including Gideon, end up worshiping the ephod instead of worshiping God. And so in the end, while Gideon doesn't become like a full-throated villain, he is a hero that actually leads the people of Israel away from God. And so we talked on Sunday about how God can make a hero out of anyone, but any hero can then become a villain. And sort of the big idea for Sunday the big application point we took out of that was this: fessing up to your fears before God is better than flexing your muscles before an audience. And we talked about how to be a hero in the circumstances we're facing. We need to constantly be confessing our fears to God and asking God for help, because at the point at which we start flexing our muscles before God or flexing our muscles before people to show them how strong and courageous and heroic we are, we can actually end up becoming a villain because we're drawing the attention to ourselves instead of allowing the attention to rest with God. So our big idea was fessing up to your fears before God is better than flexing your muscles before an audience. And we talked some on Sunday about how we all sort of think that we have to present ourselves as heroic and brave and strong and courageous so that people will deem that we are heroes. But really, to be a hero, what we need to do is just present ourselves to God as the fearful, doubtful creatures that we sometimes are, so that God can turn us into heroes, because God takes us when we're weak, and he does indeed make us strong. So that was kind of where we went with Sunday's sermon. Here's your 3 jumping off questions for this week. Number 1, have you ever felt like Gideon, sort of this reluctant hero, this scaredy cat sort of person who's been called to things bigger than you feel like you can handle? So number 1, have you ever felt like Gideon? And if so, when was that, and how did you deal with it? Share a little bit about that with your group. Jumping off question number 2 is this: what is most encouraging to you about the way God dealt with Gideon? In other words, when you look at how God handled Gideon and turned Gideon into a hero, what encouragement is there from that for you? And jumping off question number 3 is, how can you go about talking honestly with God about those times when you feel unsure, doubtful, or afraid? And in addition to that, do you believe that God can or will give you signs that will give you courage and help you move forward with what he wants you to do? And if so, how might he do that? Guys, that's this week's community group video. Hope you guys are having a good group meeting, and I'll see you Sunday or around town before then.